Repurposing your podcast content is an amazing way to extend the life of your podcast episodes. Wait a minute, who are we kidding? If you have ever taken your podcast content and turned it into short form content for social media, only to get 2 likes, 4 spam comments, and no new podcast listeners, you're not alone. That's why I invited my good friend Luis Camejo, co-host of the Content is Profit podcast, to join me in the studio today to show you the 5 biggest mistakes that podcasters make that cause this to happen so that you can learn how to keep it from happening to you. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Luis, welcome to the show. Dude, I am so excited to have you here.
Courtney, so excited, honored. I know you have some spicy questions there, so I'm ready.
Okay, well, look, I'm just going to come out and say it because here's what I know our listeners are thinking. Repurposed podcast content doesn't work. We all hoped it would, but so far I think all we've really accomplished is adding more work to our plate, and maybe a few more spam comments and DMs and like terrible pitches hitting our inboxes. But I want your hot take, Luis, on why this idea of quote unquote repurposed content, at least in the way that most people think about it, usually falls short.
Good question. And very valid, to be completely honest. I want to first reframe it to where let's talk about multipurposing instead of repurposing, right? Because if we're talking about, let's say, a podcast episode and then we grab the clips from that episode, then yes, multipurposing. But if we create with the output in mind from step 1, then it's a little bit of a different approach. Now, I do have a question for you, right? Like, what will be the objective of this micro content, right? Sometimes it could be that we might not be aligned with, we might have a perception of, hey, this piece of content is going to help me do X. But then we might have to realign what the goal of that piece of content is to be able to consider it successful for your community and the people that listen to your show. Like, in their minds, what's a micro content or repurposing success?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of them, they think that, okay, if podcasting, it's my long form content. If I can take all that valuable stuff that I'm saying inside of my episodes, chop it up, and then there's my content for social media. So I don't have to think about creating additional content. And if that content's valuable enough, well, then that's going to bring me leads. That's going to bring me sales. That's going to bring me clients. It's going to help me grow my following and grow my reach. Speaking for myself, for a long time, I hadn't nailed down a specific objective or a specific goal with that short form content. I just was under this assumption that, well, the more content I can put out, and as long as it's valuable, well, then that's going to naturally grow my audience, which is going to naturally lead to more sales. I found out the hard way that's not really the case.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably if you're listening right now, you believe that long form content builds relationship, builds rapport, builds trust, right? And eventually there's going to be a little bridge that goes from the content to, monetization in a way. So where I think people are putting the micro content is they have long form content over here. And if you're looking at the video, I'm signaling to one side, the long form. And then you have monetization on the other side. And where people are putting their micro content is like right in between them. Like, oh, I have my long form. Then people are going to see also my short form. And then they're going to go to my offer, for example. And what we've seen, our experience and other people that we've helped or that we've also studied, is that the very first end is a micro content that introduces your show to new audiences, right? Because the job of short form, and this had been said by the Instagram CEO and by YouTube as well, is for you to be able to be discovered initially. So that the role of that micro content is to introduce you to you as a brand, to you as a voice, to you as a content creator. And then a percentage of that will go and, hey, let me find out more about Courtney. Let me find out more about Luis. What do they do? Oh, they also have a podcast. I am a podcast listener. Let me listen to that podcast, or let me go to that YouTube video. And then they build more rapport with you. And then they go into your offer. So it's almost like let's switch the order of like the perception or where this content goes, even though we're creating it after the long form. The role of that micro content is to get you discovered on these social media platforms. And it's really interesting because the CEO of Instagram, for example, I'm going to use him a lot in this example because he recently had an interview where, well, he's actually been on a podcast tour where they're diving into and answering these questions for creators. And it's like, the role of Instagram as a platform, for example, is to give you a ton of tools as a creator to really express your creativity. And there's different ways that you can do that. You can do clips of like reels, right? You can do pictures, you can do carousels, you can do stories, you can do all this. And it's almost like the stories gets presented to like your current followers mostly. The reels is for new people to discover you and start building that relationship with you. So imagine, if you're familiar with the concept of funnel, that's exactly what's happening. Now, if we switch the context on like, how do we present these reels and be like, well, my reel or my clips or my social content is really a step one in the funnel process to then bring them to me, to my longer platform, to connect with me, to create a relationship through the long form. And then those people are going to transition into my monetization system. Then now we have a path that we can measure a lot more. And just recently we did a little bit of it with like content is profit, because we've had the same issue for a long time as well. We're like, what's happening? And in our mind was like, we know it works because every time we go to events, everybody's like, I've seen your content, it's awesome. And we get all this feedback and patting the back. And we're like, but why are you not buying? Right. And, but they're listening. We're aware every time we go to an event, we know that there is a point of contact that they've interacted with us. And then some customers after that, when we have a sales conversation, that does help. Just now we're looking at the data and it's like, our piece of content has been viewed over 500,000 times without ads. And we're like, wait, what? And it's like that. We call them the content ecosystem from the show. And then it's like, obviously the show has been downloaded X amount of times. And like that has allowed us to build incredible relationships. So it's like, how do we redefine success for our content? And then we can tie down to production resources and like, how long does it take us? And all the frustration is like, and now we can start working on the process to make it as frictionless as possible so we can continue experimenting and see what works and what doesn't.
Something you said there toward the end, Louise, about the content ecosystem and this ecosystem, this idea of that maybe it's not as linear as people tend to make it out in their minds. Can you speak more to that? What do we need to be thinking about as podcast hosts in terms of how all the different pieces of content fit together in this greater ecosystem of our marketing and our marketing funnel?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, again, depends on like what the goal is, but let's assume like we want to promote our podcast episodes because that's our best way, our most consistent way, our best quality content that we put out there, right? And I think today that a lot of people, I think today the conversation is like most people can achieve frequency and consistency, right? Now it's like, how can we achieve frequency and consistency together with quality? Because that's going to start differentiating yourself from that. Because we have tools that you can record on your phone and then AI will auto clip your content and then put auto captioning. Well, everybody has that. So obviously people are just going to skim through that because they've seen it before, right? So it's like, how can we create something that's really unique, starting from our message to like quality of the message over quality of the production 100% of the time, enough time consistently. And there's micro elements that play into this, right? From how we share a story to like, how are we recorded on camera? Like what's the quality of the video to what's the quality of the edit? Like most people fall into the quality of the edit, blaming that as success or not success. But there's a lot more that goes into something like that. So first is like defining that role of that micro content. So in our case, it's like we just want our micro content to put us out there consistently, frequency, and start getting people into our world. And then how do you connect that micro content to your show? Well, it could be a call to action inside of the clip. It could be like a little lower third. It could be, an end card, but also we have to be looking at the data on the micro clips, like how long people consume that micro clip. YouTube gives you really, really, really good data. So we found out that for our 59-second clips, most people watch the first 30 seconds, right? We're like, perfect. We're just going to put the call to action at the beginning of the clip as a lower third and see what happens. So we have to start measuring this. And I think that's the part where most people ignore. It's like, okay, I produced it, I expect it, but then we don't learn anything from it to start changing and adapting to where like, what's the feedback that I'm getting from this production? So starting there as in, okay, what's the role of my whole plethora of content every single week is to drive X. We had a client that her goal was to drive book sales, right? So she reframed her show to, instead of 1 hour a week, a conversation, we did 5-minute daily podcast episodes. And every day there was 3 pieces of micro content going out. And our theory is that most people try to avoid initially high volume, let alone high volume with quality, is because they might not have the resources, meaning time or the money to invest in somebody that can do that, to be able to do it. And we're actually speaking on stage once, and it was a panel, and we're sharing this theory with people where, like, when we found our system, which we call the M2M, which is what we execute for our clients, we triple output. And guess what? There was no negative effect. At that point, everybody was talking. It's like, no, post 2 to 3 times on social media. That's enough. That's too much. And you hear on the other extreme people like Gary Vee or Grant Cardone at the time that were like, post more. And you're like, how can I post more? I can't figure this out. Well, it turns out they had a big team that could do that. So we reverse engineer on our specific case for our podcast, and we decided that we were going to publish 15 to 20 pieces of content, of micro content per week on top of 3 episodes a week. And guess what? We just got bigger numbers, and we just got more data to learn from. And there was no negative repercussions to it. It's like less people. No, if more content, more people are looking at it. More people are consuming it. We're receiving more data. So our theory at the point was like, okay, people don't have the resources. So that's why they lean towards what they know. And to me, there's no wrong path. It's like, what's your hypothesis? Do you have the capacity and the production to put it out there and read that data and adapt from there? And then you're going to be able to make micro decisions every single week to continue to steer towards that. So with Amanda and her book, that's what happened. We started changing the call to actions. So instead of listening to the podcast, go purchase the book, because it's not a high ticket thing, but it was like a $7 thing. And she ended up being a bestseller after 3 months of campaign. It was 3 months of doing that consistently and revising and so on. So again, for each business or each creator might be a little bit different, but the fundamentals are there.
There's so much here that I want to unpack with you, because I think a lot of people are under this assumption that, well, if I put out content, I am quote unquote measuring the success of that content by the number of likes that I get, by the number of comments that I get, by the overall engagement that I get on this particular post, not necessarily thinking about how that piece of content, A, is functioning in the greater ecosystem of all that we're creating for our business, for our brand, but B, also looking at these little micro pieces of content and saying, well, that one only got 27 views. It failed. Rather than what you're describing, Luis, which is looking at it from the process of experimentation. So I want to back up to something that you said a minute ago about tracking this and then making these micro adjustments along the way, which I think, I talk a lot about doing this for your podcast. And this goes across the board for your content as well, any kind of content that you're putting out. So as podcast hosts, what metrics do we need to be looking at, especially when it comes to this multi-purposing of our content? I know there's podcast metrics, but let's say for short form content that we might be pulling out of our podcast to share on social media. Are there certain key metrics that you help your clients look at that we should be aware of as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, initially it's like consumption. It's like, are actually people consuming our content? What percentage of that could be new people versus people that already follow, our social media accounts? What usually happens is like when people come to our service, they might have a following, right? And it might not be a big following, but it might be people that know them already by certain things and they're trying something new. So if we post consistently, very rapidly about that something new, the people that used to follow you, that might not be of interest anymore. So they might even be a decline of, people in your network. So we have to be aware of that. After that, it's like, okay, are we adding consistent people into, our social media channels? If yes, great. What's working? If not, why not? Like, do we have a clear call to action? Like, for the longest time, our podcast clips were just like, and to this day, still, our specific case is we just want our face out consistently and frequency, right? Do they go listen to the podcast? In our case, if they do, we find out that on Instagram, we have a tracking link that goes out, in the profile. And we know that 9% of people that watch the shorts translate into listeners. YouTube Shorts is about 2%, which is crazy because guess what? They're not going to listen. If they're already on YouTube, they're going to probably consume it on YouTube. But also our show might not be the most YouTube friendly because we don't have crazy graphics. We don't show images of things. It's just a talking head of me and my brother, which we have to be okay with that as well. We're like, perfect. When we do shorter episodes and a little bit more edited, those tend to do a lot better. We're like, perfect. That's an indicator. On Instagram specifically, they release is the sends that people do. So if people send your content to their friend, that will create a trigger in the algorithm and that will help present that content to more people, because what they want is to build community. So also it's like learning what's the role of these platforms, right? So Instagram is all about connection and having those shared experiences. So for them, that's the most important metric. So, okay, if we know that based on what Instagram is saying publicly, perfect. How do we optimize our clips so we can be like people hitting the send button? So, hey, if you like this joke, or if you like this, send it to your best friend. Or if you like this tip, send it to 3 business owners that might need it, for example, right? And then I started sharing that. So that's really interesting to me. And I'm a big content consumer of anyways. Like I love, comedy. I love sports. I love all this. So I'm always trying to consume different types of content. And on my side, I see, okay, why are people sharing this? Why is this so funny? Why am I sending it to my group of, my family group or my group of friends? So if we reverse engineer that and be like, okay, we have an ideal listener, well, we also have an ideal social media consumer. They might not be the same person because they're consuming in different platforms. And Instagram or a YouTube Shorts consumer might not be a podcast listener. They might not even know what a podcast is, right? So there's still a gap. We have to sell the show. But they're like, oh, I'm interested in what Courtney's saying in these micro clips. What else can I know about her? So then they go to your profile and they see your feed and they click on your links, So it's like, what is a clear path that we're sending our audience through that we can measure and adapt? Like, okay, if we have 100 people on step 1, which is watching our shorts, maybe 10 of them click the link in the bio. Maybe 2 of them book the call, for example. Where do we have to make the adjustments, right? How do we make more people to click the link? How do we make more people to book the appointment? So now with that one clear path, we can make better decisions.
So for someone listening right now, Luis, who is kind of in the thick of that, where they're like, okay, I want my podcast to be the hub of my marketing and of my content. That's one of the reasons why I created my podcast to begin with, so that I could not have so much heavy lifting to do in creating all these little short form pieces of content. But maybe they've used some of those AI editors and it's just grabbing clips and they're posting those and it's not getting any engagement. It's definitely not driving leads and conversions. What would you say would be the first step for them to take in terms of not just making their content more effective, but maybe rethinking their entire strategy as a whole based on what we have been talking about?
Yeah, good question. I think step number 1 is like, let's do a real assessment of what's happening. Sometimes we perceive something to be true when in reality, it might not be. When we first started our business, it was a side gig. And at the time I was a studio manager in a fitness studio, and my brother would come in and he would do the videos for like all 10 locations. And that's how it started. And then business owners started contacting us and we will go to brick and mortars and record content for like the full month. And that's how it was born. And I remember we were trying to sell this service, and the owners of the gyms that we were in were so excited of the stuff that was happening that they started introducing us to other business owners. And we had this pitch meeting one time where it's like 7 other business owners, and we're going through the examples and things. And one of the guys stands up and he's like, okay, well, this is all great, but where's your content? Where's your stuff? We had nothing as BizBros, right? We had nothing out. And it was like a really gut punch moment where I was like, oh, well, we do it for this. And he's like, but why don't you do it for yourself? Right. Like, and it sucked because we didn't close any business, even though we came referred and they were all in the room. And he was like, oh, so we made a commitment. We're like, from today on, we have to be consistent online. And I don't know how that's going to look, but we have to be online for people to like see it and get to know us and so on and see the message and what we have to say. But at the time we were freelancing, and it was, so the first thing that we did was like, okay, we don't have a team. How much time do we have to actually create the thing that we want to create? And we both did our inventory, and specifically to me, I had 1 hour a day that I could dedicate fully to this. So I'm okay, that's my container. What can I create within an hour that can be consistent? So yes, I could have probably created a very fancy content map with like, I create 5 different pieces of content and edit this way and do this. And at the time, there was no AI tools to help you out, right? But quickly I realized, is this sustainable? So the sustainable path for me at the point was, I'm going to do 1 Facebook Live a day. Because guess what? If we go through the 6 phases that, we've talked about earlier, it's like what do I say? It's like, I'm just going to share a story of something that I learned today. And then I am going to reflect on it and I'm doing a call to action. How do I create it? In my phone, in whatever location, when 12 hits the clock. It doesn't matter where I'm at. I'm just going to do that. The production, there's no production because I'm going live. As soon as I hit record, that's being published as we go, right? Distribution, Facebook Live at the moment. And then I started downloading it and put it on LinkedIn. And then monetization is I want people to connect with me on social. I want people to comment. I want people to do a call with me. So every single day I just tested a different call to action. And that was my framework. And we did that for 45 days. And then we did it again for another 45 days. And then that framework allowed us to then expand it and create the podcast and publish 3 episodes a week, which for a lot of people is kind of crazy. But if you do an assessment of what are your current resources, call it time, call it money, call it team, what can we create inside of that container to start measuring and then adapting? So our 45 Live ended up being a 3 times a week podcast, which I think we just crossed the 500th episode, which is crazy to me. Plus each episode gives us a bunch of content. So it has evolved, but under the same framework.
I love this. And also just the reminder of starting where you are and that it's okay to be where you are. You don't have to be at the level of content creation that a lot of these people out there who we just by default compare ourselves to and looking at, well, they have a big team behind the scenes that's helping them get all this content out. If you're a solopreneur, that's not going to be your reality yet, but kind of looking at that and taking a step back and saying, okay, but where am I now? And what's the first step to get to where I need to go? So thank you for reminding us of that, Louise. And also, I know there's a big difference between content creation and this multi-purposing that we're talking about and the distribution of that content, which I'm like super excited to dig into in the next episode, because this is something that a lot of people have questions about as well. So thank you for all that you've shared with us today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
And now you know why repurposing your podcast content isn't just about chopping it up into short form clips that you blast across social media and hope for the best. It's about changing the way you look at turning your long form content into short form content to begin with. And that starts before you plan a single episode. So if you want more tips on how to get even more out of the podcast content that you are already working so hard to create, make sure to check out the Content is Profit podcast, which we've linked to in the show notes for you. And then stick around, because in the next episode, Louise is back and we're talking about the 5 signs that your podcast content is blending in and how to share your content so that it reaches the right people at the right time. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.